So, hello everyone. Welcome to the Joseon History Society Zoom event. My name is Sean Han, and I'm one of the event coordinator of the Joseon History Society. The Joseon History Society, which was founded in 2021, is a public learned society that offers opportunities to scholars and researchers to develop and host public resources for the study, research, and teaching of Korea's past. We were able to host a total of 9 events with participation from scholars in Korea, North America, and Europe. The previous talks are now available from our YouTube channel. So please subscribe to our channel to access those previous talks and get an update for the new contents. You can simply type Joseon History Society in YouTube search box to locate our channel. So before we begin hearing from our today's speaker, Dr. Chong Daham, I'd like to give a brief introduction of Dr. Chong and his work. So Daham earned his master and a PhD degree from Korea University. And after that, Daham was a research professor at the Research Institute of Comparative History and Culture at Hanyang University. And currently, Daham is an associate professor in the School of Humanities and Social Science at Sangmyung University in Seoul. Daham is a prolific writer, and he's an author of multiple articles, both in Korean and English. And Daham's expertise covers from history of pre-modern Korea, history of Korea's foreign relations, with a focus of Joseon State's relation with Jurchens and Tsushima Island, history of medical and spiritual knowledge during the Joseon period, post-colonial critique of Korean nationalist historiography, and the relation between Korean history and entertainment business, just to name a few. I'm a big fan of Daham's work since I was an undergrad back in Korea 15 years ago, and still I am. When I taught East Asian history at Dickinson College in 2020, I assigned Daham's article that was written in English titled Making Joseon's Own Tributaries, Dynamics Between the Ming-Centered World Order and Joseon-Centered Regional Order. And my students loved it. So I'm really excited to hear from Daham from today's presentation. And you can find more details about Daham from our Joseon History Society website. Professor Chong Daham's today's talk is titled The Rise of South Korean New Rights, Revisionist Historiography on King Sejong and the Issues of Post-coloniality in South Korean Historiography. Dr. Chong Daham's talk will be about 50 to 55 minutes. And after his talk is done, then we will have about 20 to 30 minutes of question and answer session. So, without further ado, please join me welcoming Dr. Chong Daham. Daham, you may now start sharing your presentation. Daham, could you please unmute yourself? And apologize for the connectivity of my voice. Yeah, something that was not working functionally at this moment. So I apologize for that. And Daham, there is a button on the right bottom, left right bottom of the screen that you can click to unmute yourself. Okay.
So you can hear me, right?
Crystal clear.
Yeah. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's really nice to meet you. Thank you for coming. It's been a while, Isabel. It's really nice to see you here. Anyway, nice to see you, everyone. Before I get started, I'd like to thank Shishang Wang and Sean for giving me this chance to do this talk. And before I get started, let me tell you this quickly. I am doing this not because my English is good enough to do this, but because I feel kind of responsible for responding to Yi Yong-hun 선생님's historiography on Sejong, because I do Joseon Dynasty history and Sejong era too, and I want to do that. I want to do this as a practice of heterolingual address and call for transnational solidarity to deal with this kind of far-right revisionist historiography. So so you will see a lot of text, too many text on my PPT, so please understand that. Okay, I'll just get started. My presentation, the title is The Rise of South Korean New Right Revisionist Historiography on King Sejong and the Issues of Post-coloniality in South Korean Historiography. Sean, how can I I'm sorry, I have used WebEx mostly. I'm not really good at using how can I turn the page? Okay, it's working now. Thank you. So this quotation from quote from Professor Tessa Morris Suzuki. She's talking about, she's highlighting historical truthfulness rather than historical truth. The concept of this really important to me, so that's why I actually cited this quote in here. Okay, then I'll just get started, really. Renowned South Korean historian, economic historian Yi Yong-hun's arguments on King Sejong in YouTube lecture series back in like 2016, and its publication into a book called Sejong, kwayŏn, 성군인가 in 2018 has triggered controversial dispute across the public media space. South Korean far-right revisionist arguments Japanese colonial issue, including comfort women, represented in the book Pan-Il Chongjokjuui. You are probably familiar with this book, published in 2019, that drew more attention, have actually originated from this book. The book's argument, phenomenal impacts, and reaction from the public audience represent the realities of Korean academia, politics, and society in the realities of post-colonial era. By historicizing them based on post-colonial perspective, this paper seeks to rethink where the studies of Korean history in South Korea have been, where it is now, and where it is going to be, historiographically and politically. Those are the main questions I'd like to answer in my talk. Where exactly do his arguments come from within the context of South Korean historiography since the late 90s? How do his arguments on Sejong and his rule work within the current academic and social political context of South Korea? How do they end up supporting Japanese far-right revisionist historiography arguments on perennial issues, including comfort women? And then I'll talk about some crucial points on the issues of post-coloniality in the studies of Korean history exposed by controversies of Yi Yong-hun's book. I'll talk about what historians of Joseon history should rethink to deal with far-right revisionist historiography like this in the age of new media and post-truth. There will be no fact checking because I believe my study of history and historiography is to pursue historical truthfulness, not to pursue truth or fact. So how do we map Yi's argument within South Korean historiography since late 90s? Post 1945 South Korean historiography's nationalist narrative came to face serious critiques for the first time since late 90s. There was this group of scholars centered on economic history such as An Byung-jik and Yi Yong-hun called Nakseongdae School to criticize the narrative of nationalist historiography on Korea's own modernization. They started reappropriating arguments Japanese colonial historiography has essentialized. They took it further, arguing that colonialization has helped Korea's overall modernization process, and they ended up essentializing Eurocentric perspective and superiority of Western and Japanese modernity. On the other side, there is another group of historians starting to offer different kind of critique on South Korean historiography. These historians have initiated post-colonial studies based on transnational perspective in Korean academia since early 2000s. We start. It doesn't work. I can't turn the page. I can't.
Do you mind doing the steps back again, kind of ending the full screen and then, yeah.
Okay, I don't mind. Well, if that is the only way I can do this.
At least that way it works. So yeah, let's try it again.
Can I pause? Oh, I'll just pause occasionally when I have to do this. Okay, then Yi Yong-hun 선생님 had appropriated their critiques on the nationalist narrative, and he joined their conferences and book project based on post-colonial ideas in 2004. Ever since he did this, pioneering works of those historians has long been labeled as public enemy of South Korean historiography, and this was stigmatization. I need to make a quick historiographical explanation and clarification here. 이성시 from Waseda University's work, 만들어진 고대, is a critical analysis on invention of 고구려 and 발해 history as the integral part of national history across many nation states, including Korea, Japan, and China. 임지연 선생님's works, 민족주의는 반역이다, 국사의 신화를 넘어서, 근대 국경, 역사의 변경. They offer a critical review nationalist narrative of South Korean historiography and territorialization of history, victimhood nationalism, and transnational comparative studies to critically rethink of seemingly confronting features between colonialism and nationalism as something they both share. 윤회동 선생님's work, 식민지 회색지대, is also a critical analysis on what Japanese nationalism and Korean nationalism shared within the concept of modernity. There's two more scholars' work I want to introduce. 윤선태 선생님's work, 통일신라의 발명과 근대 역사학의 성립, is a critical analysis on how the term 통일신라 had been invented by Japanese colonial historiography and how Korean historiography later on have appropriated it. My works, well, I'm not going to read them through, but those works offer critical analysis on how the images of early Joseon history was invented within the nationalist narrative of post-1945 South Korean historiography, how victimhood nationalism worked within that narrative on Joseon Sade and Kyorin, and how Joseon Sade came to be reinvented as its international diplomacy of independent sovereign within the historical context of Cold War and South Korea-US relationship in there. So all these scholars' works offer poignant critiques on how come colonialism and nationalism coming next to it both share the epistemic hierarchy appropriated from Eurocentric ideas in the name of modernity.
Daham, would you mind using the mouse cursor to kind of to show up your mouse cursor and use the click button to turn the pages?
Oh, it's impossible because it's 전체
I
화면.
see.
Yeah.
So maybe
Anyway,
then,
I'll
we'll
just
need to
keep
go
doing
back.
this.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Then let me ask you this question. I mean, should these historians be labeled as if they were traitor of Korean nation and colonial collaborator by the nationalist side, just because Yi Yong-hun 선생님 was seemingly involved with them and he cited Lee Seong-si, Im Ji-yeon, Yoon Hae-dong, and my works? I mean, this has been really a big problem for me because it's been, I get that from everywhere for more than like 10 years. So this group actually invited Yi Yong-hun to participate in this significantly symbolic conference and the book project based on the conference papers called 국사의 신화를 넘어서 2004, because they didn't want to isolate him and demonize him in the same way nationalist Korean historian did. At least this group gave him a fair chance and tried to use that chance for further productive discussions. Yi Yong-hun has already been criticized by many historians during the conference discussion, and their critiques were included in the chapter of the book 국사의 신화를 넘어서. So can we put this kind of stigmatization behind and go beyond this conflict? So let's turn to the next chapter. Why is he leaving out necessary historiographical analysis on existing works on early Joseon history in his book he called 학술서? One of the conspicuous things I felt reading his book is that he wrote in his book, 지금의 이 책은 제1강 세종의 과연 성군인가의 강의 노트를 학술서로서 평가받을 수 있는 분량과 형식으로 확장한 것이다. He first gave YouTube internet lectures with the same title, 세종 과연 성군인가, in 2016, and then he published it into a book later on. So it actually tells you what happened back then as a context, and then it means he wants this book to be a 학술서, meaning professionally academic book. He said the book's main goal is to debunk illusion, 환상, and falsehood 거짓 of Korean historiography, which still beholds Sejong as a myth. To do that, he essentialized two main arguments as undeniable facts. First one is 세종에 의해 조선의 노비제와 기생제가 만들어졌다는 사실. The second one is 세종에 의해 사대주의 국가체제가 정비되었다는 사실. He literally have written this way. These two consist of the main structure and all the details simply support it. On the other hand, as an authentic academic book, 학술서, at least, I guess, this book should have provided its own solid case studies on Sejong and what he did regarding 사대 and slavery issues, including 기생, but he didn't, actually. As a 학술서, at least, this book should have provided critical analysis on the layers existing historiography on what Sejong did regarding 사대 issues and slavery issues, including 기생, on the other hand. Considering these subjects are out of his specialization, to me, completely leaving out historical analysis on existing frameworks of nationalistic historiography on what Sejong has done seems even more problematic to me. He should have gone through 이상백, 이성무, and Han Young-woo's work on slavery issues at least, before he comes up with the argument that Sejong is the one who essentializes Joseon's submissive relation with Ming as the very cornerstone of the state system, he should have gone through Shinseok-ho, 전해종, 고병익, 민현구, and Han Young-woo's major works since 1945, at least. Then why does Yi Yong-hun, who used to be a very established historian in his own specialization of economic history, has processed his argument in this seemingly suicidal way, leaving out indispensable historiographical analysis and going too far from his own major? With that being said, the first thing I want to talk about is he has been marginalized and demonized by those nationalist historians of Korean history for a long time. That's why he defined existing frameworks of post-1945 South Korean historiography as ultimate illusion and falsehood. Basically, I think he's doing mirroring. Then that gives him immunity so that he does not have to go through all these layers of complicated historical context of where those major works of nationalist historiography came from. And this made me think about the politics of minority and the ethical dimension of studying history as a practice of politics. The second thing I would like to discuss is that in doing so, he quite often appropriated critical ideas from post-colonial studies. For example, post-colonial terms such as 발명, invention from invention of tradition, 상상 from imagined community are very metaphoric terms. These terms enabled post-colonial historians to figure out the gap between what they have found under the thick layers of modern historiography and the images of history those layers have essentialized as undeniable fact or truth. With his modernity-oriented perspective based on 실존주의, which he actually shared with those historians he hates, he cannot really understand this context. However, at least he still thinks these terms are useful to tear down those conventional images of existing frameworks of nationalist historiography, and he started decontextualizing and appropriating them by totally getting rid of that metaphoric gap there. Then dichotomy based on essentialization of truth and falsehood comes back. We're stuck in there, literally. The third thing I want to point out is academic authenticity he's using in his so-called 학술서 actually further facilitate popularization of his academic works and commercial profit. It is quite general idea that we should deal with academic pursuit of the studies of history and popularization of the studies of history separately. However, it was authenticity that he and the media have actually emphasized to raise purchasing desire of the public audience for his online lecture and the books. So let me turn to next chapter. Where exactly is his criticism heading beyond the existing conventional images of Sejong South Korean historiography has invented? Leaving out necessary historiographical analysis consequently led him practically ignore motivation of decolonization Sangmyung represented in those layers of nationalist historiography. At least he should respect. If he ignores it, then I don't know, why would study history? I mean, at least that was the minimum responsibility he had to keep up with. But at least Korean historians made effort to come up with these nationalist narrative to refute Japanese historiography's argument that Korean society never reached the level of feudal system in its history, and to argue Korean history has evolved linearly into the stage of feudal and early modern stages in similar pattern as Western and Japanese history did. Entire studies of early Joseon history of social status system, including slavery, was to argue that early Joseon has evolved into a bureaucratic society from Goryeo feudal aristocracy, and therefore the social status system, including Yangban, Jungin, Yangin, and Chonin, has also evolved into the stage where all of them were allowed some upward social mobility based on meritocracy and the law. the renowned debate between 4 social status system arguments and 2 social status system called 양천제 since 70s, led by Yi Yong-hun and Han Young-woo, were not at all contradicting each other, but actually came from the same historical context where both sides redefined 양반 as bureaucratic elites, not as aristocrats. At least these arguments was to refute Japanese colonial arguments, which had defined Joseon's social status system as backward, caste-like social hierarchy topped by 양반 aristocrats. Post-colonial studies and gender studies were rapidly introduced since 1990s. Since then, crossing the boundaries of women's identity defined by politics of masculinity of both the colonialism and nationalism have shared. Some Korean historians of women's studies came up with very critical and innovative works recently. Those 2 volumes of the book are something you might want to read. 대중독재와 여성, 신사임당 그녀를 위한 변명. But then again, the entire existing frameworks of nationalist historiography, but then again, he never paid attention to this kind of work. The entire existing frameworks of nationalist historiography on early Joseon, 사대 from 50 to 90 are to decolonize Japanese colonial historiography's argument that has essentialized Joseon 사대 to Ming and Qing as Korea's hopeless nature of dependency on foreign forces. Historians such as Yi Baek have distinguished Joseon's action of 사대 to China from 사대주의 by critiquing that 사대주의 is a term Japanese colonialism has created to essentialize 사대 as Koreans' dependent nature. And he argued that Joseon 사대 was based on realistic diplomacy to protect its sovereignty. That's done in late 60s and alongside like 70s with other scholars too. In 2002, Korea Between Empire, Andre Schmidt shows how 사대, which has been widely accepted as a universal mode of Joseon-Qing relationship within the context of Confucian tributary order, began to be quickly redefined as the most shameful tradition of Joseon, which represent its deeply rooted dependent nature on foreign forces. He pointed out that this redefinition of 사대 was suggested by Japanese colonialism, and it was also widely shared by Korean nationalists. I started thinking about what nationalist intellectuals could appropriate from Japanese colonialism and the dilemma of sharing modernity with colonialism. Then I realized this kind of redefinition of 사대 since late 19th century through the colonial period again came to be redefined within the post-1945 Cold War context of East Asia, when Koreans had to meet US hegemony and Japan's new position under that hegemony. So I wrote 2 articles. Those 2 articles are about what I have been just introducing to you. I'm sorry. Let me share again. Okay. Until mid-2000, existing. Oh, I forgot to say this. He knew there had been this kind of work in there, but he completely dismissed and ignored those works. Until mid-2000, existing frameworks on early Joseon's warfare in 15th century have been explained only within the narrow narrative of self-defense. At least this results from South Korean historians' efforts to decolonize colonial arguments that Korea has been very vulnerable and submissive to foreign forces. Then the following question came along to me, reading primary sources of Shillok from very late 15th century to late, from very late 14th century to late 15th century. Yi Seong and his successors have launched 3 major military expeditions into Tsushima for 3 decades and 7 major military expeditions into the local Jurchen societies. They have executed those Jurchen leaders who were given official titles by Ming emperors, and they got away with this. They have appropriated imperial authority centered on Sinitic Confucian world order to secure their own authority above those Jurchen leaders who have been entitled as Ming's emperor vassal by imperial authority. How was it possible then? Why have the South Korean historians only defined these aggressions represented in early Joseon warfare as simply self-defense? I came up with critical historical analysis that it was this narrative of victimhood nationalism that actually has made South Korean historians define early Joseon aggression in its warfare only as minimum self-defense. And I took it further through mid-2010s with the case studies on how early Joseon kings such as Taejong, Sejong, and Sejo tried to justify consolidation of their power over those Jurchen and Tsushima local societies on the frontier regions. By appropriating Sinitic framework of Confucian warfare concept of Jeongfa, Jeongbal in Korean, all the rituals including collection of head, ears, and noses from the dead Jurchens, and all the technologies including clock, calendar, and firearm weapons in the battlefield in the name of Confucian Holy War. And those 2 articles I have published. It's about what I have just told you. And I did these researches to critically understand how South Korean historiographers attempt to decolonize colonial historiography on Joseon's relations with its neighbors ended up using the similar hereditary victimhood many colonialism have practiced to justify their aggression. Meanwhile, it's not just me. Yi Yŏng-hun has tried to rethink early Joseon's warfare against Jurchen and Tsushima within the complicated web of relation where Joseon, Jurchen, Tsushima, Ming, and Muromachi Bakufu were all tangled up. Park Jung-min has provided critical review on this widely accepted practice of modern Korean historians take it for granted to use those discriminating terms early Joseon ruling elites have deployed to define those Jurchens as less civilized tributary or barbarians in their modern academic writings and the history textbook we have learned and our kids are still learning. And So Seung-gyu's work shows how exactly Sejong was able to appropriate heavenly authority and its warfare without practicing the same imperial ritual that represented heavenly authority of emperor in person for the warfare, or transferred that heavenly authority to his army by bestowing symbolic axes called fuyue, puor, on the commander. So Yi Yong-hun never tried to go over those major frameworks of South Korean historiography, which invented nationalist images of early Joseon history until late 90s. He never tried to go over all these relatively recent researches I have talked about either. He never tried to embrace post-colonial critiques that enable us to see what represents coloniality there, again, in the form of modernity itself, even in the era nationalism defined as the age of decolonization. Then where are his anti-nationalist arguments, which have defined entire South Korean historiography as very narrow-minded, exclusive, and excessively prejudiced falsehood and falsehood consequently heading? Well, that's too simple. His arguments end up slipping into murky depths of colonialism. Seemingly, his argument looks criticizing inhumanity in Joseon slavery. Then is he really emphasizing that we should care about political and social minority and those slaves' subjectivity? Then why doesn't he mention all those slaves who frequently appear to secure upward mobility by satisfying Joseon court through their military and financial contribution? Why doesn't he mention all those bandits who frequently appear to rebel against Joseon's rigid social status system, even in Sejong and Munjong's reign? And why does he keep substantializing this inhumane nature of Choson slavery practice by highlighting it as uniquely Korean? He highlights total lack of humane sense of dignity for human being in Choson slavery practice compared to the cases of slavery practice in other civilizations. This reminds me of Fukuda Dokujo's argument that there's no humane sense of dignity for Nobi in Choson, and this relationship between the slave and the owner is not even close to the relationship between the serf and the lord in feudal society of Europe. And then the same was for his arguments on 기생 as the core part of female slavery. He wrote, 관리의 기생 가늠이 비난을 받은 것은 기생의 인권을 위해서가 아니었다. Meaning, the reason why the courts criticized official sexual exploitation of 기생 was not because it was assumed even those 기생 at least had human rights. He also wrote, 기생에게 인권 따위는 없었다. Meaning there was no sense of human rights on 기생. Seemingly, he seems to criticize that the practice of 기생 in Choson was against the universal value of 인권 and 도덕. That's the word he was using actually. Seemingly, his arguments sound as if he cares about women and gender issues. But then again, if he's aware that using this term 위안 dismisses the whole context of male sexual exploitation against women and justify that exploitation or slavery, then why does he keep using this term 위안 throughout his book to describe what male 양반 ruling elites, including military officers, have exploited from those 기생 women in Choson? He seems to criticize prejudice of those 양반 Confucian ruling elites that female slaves have no sense of chastity. They are sexually promiscuous. Then again, he comes up with the primary sources to highlight that this female slave called 돌금 sincerely keep up with the rituals for her dead husband, who was slave also, whose name was 야찰. He even wrote about the attitude of this female slave 돌금, 죽은 남편을 그리워하며 예를 다하는 비의 모습이다. 비도 여성인 이상, as far as she's woman, the slave is woman, chastity should be in her nature. Isn't that terrifying? I mean, I couldn't believe what I was reading when I first actually saw this kind of passage. His arguments on women ends up essentializing very much masculinity-oriented idea that every woman, regardless of social status, should be capable of having strong sense of chastity. His criticism on sexual exploitation of women practiced by male ruling elites in Choson is only to support his argument that Confucian society of Choson ruled by those male ruling elites has no sense of basic human rights, which is the universal value from Western modernity to his eyes. So what about the subjectivity of those women? Then why does he keep emphasizing relative backwardness of this Confucian society of Choson by essentializing this practice of 기생 in Choson as an integral part of Choson's unique custom? On Choson Sade, he argued different from militarized Korea state, Choson became submissive because Sejong served Ming Emperor sincerely as suzerain by giving up building Choson-centered world order, offering Choson women for Ming Imperial House, giving up designing its own rituals that represent Choson King's heavenly authority in the warfare. He wrote, 군국의 의지는 세종조를 거치면서 뿌리가 뽑히고 있었다. He sarcastically satirized that Choson's own motivation of militarism was not even necessary because the vessel served the suzerain so sincerely by writing 제후가 천자를 성심으로 섬길 텐데 무슨 독자 의지에 군국이 필요하단 말인가. He's actually laughing at it. He also highlighted it was Choson court itself who voluntarily asked Ming to finalize its dynasty name as Choson, which represent its inherited Chinese legacy from ancient 기자 조선 by writing 기자 조선을 잇는 취지의 국호를 명예 자청한 것. Then he continued to conclude that Korean history has become a part of Chinese history by writing 이후 한국사는 중국사의 일환으로 전개되었다. This was really quite shocking to me. Then he also concluded Joseon's 4대 relationship with China was not just military political polemic, but was completely assimilated as metaphysical order for Joseon by writing 중국과의 4대 관계는 정치 군사적 명분을 넘어 인간 사회 국가의 세계를 포괄하는 형이상학적 질서로 내면화하였다. If his criticism and sarcasm is to remind South Korean people that their state should be at least able to exist as an independent sovereign, then why did he totally dismiss South Korean historiography's motivation to decolonize Japanese colonial historiography's argument that essentialized Joseon's 4대 as deeply rooted dependent nature of Korea itself? If his criticism is to remind South Korean people that to defend their states, independent sovereignty is important, and further to remind them how to do it without offending other states' independence at the same time, then why did he totally dismiss significance of those relatively new critical research works since late 2000? I mentioned above. He knew those relatively new historiography was coming. Why does he keep substantializing Joseon's 4대 as something that represents submissiveness, dependency, and ultimate assimilation? Why does he bother to emphasize so-called universal values such as freedom of individual, sovereignty, and democracy? All came from Western modernity by referring to 이승만's speech and writing 초대 대통령은 신생 대한민국의 기초가 되는 정치 이념이 서양 민주국에서 유래했음을 숨기지 않았다. He kept saying that there's no such concept of individual freedom in Confucian tradition in China and in Korea. Why does he even bother to explicitly emphasize the US model should be the final destination of Korean state by writing 이 나라는 미국과 같은 자유인의 공화국으로 발전해 나갈 것이다. This picture is the picture I have taken for myself. I went there and then I found this interesting scene. Right behind King Sejong's statue, there is this flag. This flag obviously was put in there by those 태극기 부대, for the member of those far-right political organization. It feels to me as if this flag is saying that, okay, Sejong, let's say Sejong is the symbol of independence of this nation, but even then, what is most important here is to have a good relationship with the United States right now. That's the #1 priority. Okay, we're getting near the end. Chapter 5 was about how he it's about the final destination of his historiography, reinvention of Sejong by South Korean far-right revisionist historiography called New Right 역사. What we have examined above help us understand what he's trying to do with this book. He believes national narrative of Korean history on Joseon culminate in Sejong, and all these glorious images of Sejong only end up encouraging Korean nationalism to get as narrow-minded as tribalism he calls 종족주의. He's thinking nationalism of Korea is not right kind of nationalism. It's just it's on the level of tribalism. That's kind of anachronically, that's really anachronical argument. I mean, he thought so, and then we have to be more open-minded. We have to assimilate more universal civilization from Western modernity, because we're living in this age of globalization, he admires. He wants to replace them with the opposite narrative of modernization and opposite image of Sejong he invented based on South Korean far-right revisionist historiography called New Right 역사. Doing it would greatly expand the horizon of South Korean far-right revisionist historiography's view, which has been mainly limited within the narrow temporal and spatial boundary of Korean history from late Joseon to early 20th century. To substantialize those arguments of South Korean far-right revisionist history as undeniable truth, he is basically reinventing Sejong and his rule as the origin of all unique features of Korean history, which he defined as relative backwardness compared to history of Western and Japanese colonialism, by collating all the possible evidences together back to Sejong's rule. For example, his criticism emphasized rapid increase in slave population in early Joseon based on enslavement of its own kind is quite unique among many other cases of slavery. By emphasizing it, he holds Sejong responsible for institutionalizing this practice of inhumanity by arguing that Sejong banned the slaves from suing their own masters. By doing so, he's arguing that Korea's unique present reality, in which such a narrow-minded nationalism still encourages all kinds of categorical discriminations against their own kind and foreigners altogether, does not come from foreign colonialism, but actually originated from Korea's own past in Sejong's reign. I told you he's basically doing mirroring. His criticism on sexual exploitation of Kisang practiced by male military officers serving in frontier regions in Joseon is highlighted as Korea's own unique practice, not to be seen in contemporary China or elsewhere. Furthermore, he confidently holds Sejong responsible for this practice of inhumanity by arguing that it was Sejong who practically institutionalized Kisang on statewide level to comfort civil and military officers serving in local administrative and military units. Sorry. Come on. So then he essentialized this practice as Korea's own unique tradition to have comfort women for military officers by coming up with what a military officer Park Chi-mun in early 17th century kept in his journal during his service in northeastern frontier region about his sexual relations with many Kisangs there. Mentioning Park Chi-mun's relationship with his Kisang who were allocated, 당직 Kisang means the Kisang who were located in for his quarter. He actually wrote, 여기에 또 한 범주의 군 위안부가 있구나. That's what he exactly says, implying he finally realized that Kisang was Korean own tradition to have comfort women for military. Then he concluded Joseon's Kisang practice has been institutionalized as a comfort women for military from the beginning by Sejong by writing 이렇게 조선의 기생제는 당초 군 위안부의 제도로 만들어진 것입니다. I never went to it's been a long time ago. It's been a while since I last visited this place of 수요 집회. It's been a while, but after I read this kind of passage from his book, I got so mad, and then I visited this place and took this picture. And the same goes for his criticism on early Joseon 사대. He argues what Sejong did was to institutionalize 사대주의 as Joseon's status system, as he defines it with his own wording, 사대주의 국가체제. The idea of colonialism on Joseon 사대 is already recalled in there as undeniable truth that is inevitably needed or necessary for Joseon state to pursue assimilation of more universal civilization models, such as Imperial China, modern Western Europe, and modern Japan throughout history, because Joseon was unable to go beyond its particularity and reach out similar universal stages of historical development into the direction of modernity owing to its Confucian tradition. He substantialized 사대주의 as an integral part of Joseon's unique tradition by dating its origin back to Sejong's reign, by decontextualizing what Sejong did. Let's say, I mean, totally hypothetically, let's say what he argues could be true. But even then, what worse is it? If that truth only reinforces coloniality, again, in the post-colonial reality we are living in. That's why I cited this quotation from Professor Tetsamori Suzuki emphasized this concept of truthfulness, not truthness, not the truth itself. What is more frustrating? It's a bit personal, but I have to tell you this. I really have to do this quick clarification. What is more frustrating is that he decontextualized critical interpretation from post-colonial studies, including mine, and used them to support his argument. In his YouTube lecture in 2016 and his book published in 2018, he cited my new interpretation on 훈민정음 based on two articles I published in 2009 and 2013, which complement my name and my affiliation in order to support his argument. Sejong invented 훈민정음 as a tool to sincerely serve Ming as his suzerain. But that was the beginning of my nightmare and insomnia. In almost every single article of mine, I clearly manifested my approach is based on post-colonial and transnational perspective. I found out that the images of national language of Korea centered on 훈민정음, Korea have essentialized as uniquely Korean identity of self were actually created within this historical context when the first generation of modern intellectuals of Joseon came to realize that Onmun they have treated as disdainful secondary language was to be rediscovered as a scientific and efficient modern phonetic alphabet similar to Western alphabet by encountering those languages of others from the West and Japan. And then based on this idea, I try to rethink promulgation of 훈민정음 within the particular historical context from late 14th to early 15th century. What I have argued is not just the feature of 훈민정음 used to dictate sound and meaning of Chinese character was quite important at the time. There was some historians of Korean language actually did that, who actually did that long time ago, even from like 50s. But that argument on that level always ended up getting incorporated within the existing nationalist narrative that even so, main motivation of 훈민정음 was to dictate sound and meaning of Korean's own spoken language. And the other feature of 훈민정음 was just a minor function only necessary to learn foreign language. As far as these Korean scholars of history of Korean language cannot help thinking of those features of 훈민정음 as always contradicting each other, inevitably under nationalism, the only way they could deal with this dilemma is to say one is important and the other is not by defining them separately. What I exactly contributed with my work is to come up with new interpretation that those two seemingly contradicting features of 훈민정음 seen from nationalist perspective were actually the two faces of a single coin working as a pair, inseparable pair within this particular historical context when the language of Joseon and language of Middle Kingdom had to meet and encountered and then mediate through translation. I wrote those articles to show legacy of classical Chinese as the universal language of Sinitic world order cannot maintain that legacy universally in the particular domain of Joseon without the translation of it by using Joseon's language. I wrote these articles to show particularity of Joseon King's legacy cannot be maintained without the translation of those universal values of Confucianism written in classical Chinese by using Joseon's language too. Well, I've been critically analyzing this process and its inseparable relations with the politics of the global order of that time. I've never said I believe this kind of globalization was inevitable or universal. I said it was them, Joseon's Confucian scholars and King Sejong, who actually regarded this process as inevitable or universal. I've criticized those arguments that romanticize and even idealize this relationship in every single opportunity I had in my articles. I have done my research to show how what has been understood as uniquely Korean phenomena by nationalist historiography actually happened in the particular historical context where Korea had to encounter with many others in process of globalization to critically rethink that globalization process. Then how could my researches possibly empower Yi Yong-hun's argument that encourages to destroy all the boundaries between self and others and pursue assimilation into others in this process of globalization, modernization? He has done the same thing when it comes to comfort women issues. Recent researches based on gender studies have critically re-examined sexual exploitation of Korean women practiced by South Korean state and US military since Korean War. These studies were based on the critique from post-colonial studies and gender studies on what colonialism and nationalism both share on the gender issue. They have been doing this research because they found out sexual violence on women in war should not be understood as a problem of males within the category of particular nationality, but understood as more widely practiced on global level. The motivation of those researches is to expand the scope on the issues of comfort women to be more reflective and critical. Then Yi Yong-hun 선생님 appropriated these studies only to highlight it is Korean society's unique tradition to sexually exploit women of their own kind in war. This just empower Japanese far-right revisionists and their supporters to further deny what they have committed against those women who suffer for a long, long time. I mean, like saying, well, look at what Korea has done. They had this from pre-modern times. They did it in Korean War against their own women. They did it in Vietnam War against Vietnamese women. Then why us? Why only us? What he's doing here is quite reactionary. By disrupting those critical points in the map of studies of Korean history, we should use as firm stepping stones for the next step for future. He drags everything into the simple hierarchy of the truth with the universal model of Western modernity on the top and modernization of Joseon Confucian society with relative backwardness at the bottom. Then here comes the familiar dichotomy again. On the one side, we have South Korean historiography nationalist narrative incorporating both the right and left side that has defined what Sejong has done with Confucianism in early Joseon and what those Confucian scholars has done in late Joseon as undeniable evidences of sprouts of modernity from Joseon's own soil. For the two last decades, it has become more stronger by citing the works of Hamashita Takeshi, Du Wei-ming, Andre Gundefrank, Miyajima Hiroshi, and other California school scholars' work. These scholars' work here only empower this nationalist narrative to even proudly argue with Koreanized Confucian tradition, Joseon actually achieved modernity much earlier than Western Europe and Japan. Then this kind of argument make it easier for vast majority of Korean historians to mistakenly convince that all these problems of colonial historiography are gone now. Are they seriously? Because we're even now? So on the other side, there is this extreme version of South Korean far-right revisionist historiography called New Right 역사, represented by Yi Yong-hun, who has been reinventing colonial arguments through even incorporating Sejong's era into his revisionist narrativization. We are stuck in here, this bipolar. So how should we respond to Yi Yong-hun's far-right revisionist historiography? The last part. First, we should be able to recognize there has been this trap here and understand how this epistemological trap exactly works by critically studying it. We shouldn't be demonizing him. You shouldn't be just isolated him, just dismissed him. I think this is a trap designed to work on a scale that measure the weight of fulfillment of those values of modernity both sides have been universalizing. This is why I have been asserting the usefulness of post-colonial studies in my pursuit of historical truthfulness rather than historical truth. Those concepts of invention of tradition and imagined community are still useful to deconstruct what has been essentialized as undeniable fact or truth by both colonialism and nationalism, and useful to expose how this so-called fact or truth have initiated politics of depoliticization in the studies of Korean history. The post-colonial critique that the problems of colonialism repeat in nationalism is quite useful to help us recognize the relationship of both sides that ultimately make each other stronger so that they can hold you tight in between them. So I would call it hypocritical. So only then, by using the lessons we can learn from post-colonial studies, responding to Yi Yong-hun's far-right revisionist historiography, only then at least we will be able to imagine new values we can hope for from now on. Only then we can keep them as contingent as possible in the open, productive discussion and avoid substantializing them as undeniable fact or truth. And only then we'll be able to rethink Joseon history, including Sejong's era, to reinvent what we can hope for to live out the reality of post-colonial era. Well, at least to my view. Well, I have one more part. Actually, I think time's up. So I'm not going to talk about this part right here, but I'm pretty sure we're going to talk about it in discussion session or in other chances in the future. Well, it's quite important. It's how his lecture became like very hot-selling commodity called contents in Korean within the changing context where the traditional production of knowledge process doesn't really matter anymore. Okay, thank you for listening. This is for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So can everyone hear me clearly? I just changed my headphone. So let's give another big round of applause to Daham for his fascinating talk today.
Thank you so much.
And again, I apologize for the technical issues that we actually met on our events to make sure that these kind of things doesn't happen, but well, things are kind of contingent, like how the history works. Well, I know that, audience are very eager to ask you more questions about your view on Korean historiography, about this far-right political movements that is still very live in South Korea now. We have a limited time, but we'll have the question and answer sessions. So you may ask questions in two ways. First, you can use the raise hand function on the reaction button on the bottom of the screen, or you can just type down the questions in the chat box. I will read them out loud, and you can send those questions that can be seen by everyone in this room, or you can send them privately just to me so that I can read out loud those questions anonymously. So without further explanation, please take this moment to share your thoughts and ask questions. Yes, Don, please go ahead.
I'm just wondering if Yi Yong-hun or anybody else and historians in South Korea are aware of Orlando Patterson's Slavery and Social Death, in which he has a whole chapter on slavery in Korea and how unique it is, not the mistreatment, but the fact that Korean slaves, could own their own land, and so on. It's a very important book. It surveys slavery globally, and it shows how Korean slavery is unique, but it doesn't focus on Korean slavery as uniquely brutal. The opposite, in fact.
Well, thank you for comment. Thank you for pointing out that feature of slavery practice of Korean history. But the motivation of my talk, I mean, the reason why I actually from the beginning told you that I'm not gonna approach this issue based on the idea that to pursue to study history is to pursue truth or fact. I'm pretty sure what you have actually pointed out, the book, Orlando Patterson's book, probably, as far as I remember, that's the book actually Yi Yong-hun 선생님 has cited in his own book, 세종은 과연 성군인가. Well, even then, even if he actually didn't explicitly says, well, practice, there's a brutality, unique brutality in Korean society. But even then, if he kept emphasizing this is a peculiarity, this is so particular in here, then we have to think about what kind of problem that kind of perspective would produce as a discourse. Well, I wouldn't say like that's lie. Orlando Patterson's work is lie. I'm not gonna say that. I don't have to say that. That's what nationalists would says, or other historians who still essentialize the idea that our job is as a historian to study history, to figure out what was the fact in there, what was the truth in there. I try to approach this question, what they have essentialized as fact, as a discourse, which is inseparably related to the reality of the society. So yeah, people are aware that book, I guess. There are a lot of historians who read that book probably because Yi Yong-hun was introducing that book in his book. But from my perspective, I think we should wait more until we encounter many more other researches which would not approach this issue based on essentialized on truth or fact. That's all I can say right now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for those answers.
Well, basically, either way, you can do either way. You can say all post-colonial, you can say nationalist historiography is lie. You can also say colonialism is lie. You can do both of them. But I'm not saying that you can't do it in that way. But there is something that you should be responsible. I mean, the consequence of that kind of attempt as a political practice, you should be responsible for it. That's what I'm talking about. So you can do it either way, but what matters is, like Professor Tesamori Suzuki pointed out, is truthfulness. Why you're doing this? Where is the truth in that? In that kind of argument that Koreans has always been like this, like peculiar, submissive, enough to come up with sexual exploitation against their own women from Sejong's era. For me, that's really terrifying. I'm not a nationalist.
So we have a question from Patrick, and I will read aloud this question. Thank you
Okay.
for your talk. I have a short comment. I agree with your argument that we should deconstruct arguments that are presented as undeniable facts or truths.
Thank you.
My personal take here is to apply the concept of quote unquote cultural memory.
Yeah.
And Aladia Esman, I think that's the author of this
Yeah.
term, and to such deconstruction, that is to inquire how history is remembered and how such memory is constructed, revised, and disputed within a society. In other words, in regarding to the new rights, these contestations take place first and foremost in the larger context of 2010 South Korea. By doing so, I avoid calling conservative historians as outright quote unquote revisionists and speaking of personal traumas, etc. As a scholar, as such contestation over cultural memory most often evoke exactly such feelings. Rather, in this process, it is necessary to highlight the precise historical process on where the memory of Joseon in the Republic of Korea came from and how it was disputed or not. Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting for me.
Thank you for that comment. What was the name of scholar who gave
Patrick.
me that comment? Patrick.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that comment. I mean, I really enjoyed your comment. I mean, I totally agree with your idea. Totally agree with your comment. So we should approach this kind of issue from the perspective, the politics of memory. Well, that's what those small number of scholars who belong to post-colonial studies in Korean academia have done since early 2010. Professor Im Ji-yeon has been doing that in Hanyang University, and then he's now doing that project, got a funding from HK project, and then he does it right now in Seoul University. Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, that's why I try to think about where all these kind of nationalist discourses come from. I mean, the historical context. That is what I call historical context means reality we're living. We have to live out that reality. We've gone through from colonialism and we've gone through nationalism. So we're living in post-colonial era. While we're living in living out the era of nationalism, we thought everything will be decolonized, right? But after like 70 years, more than 70 years, we realized like the same thing colonialism has caused, is actually plaguing us. We're not going anywhere. So that's why we have to approach this issue based on that kind of perspective. I totally agree. Thank you. Any question is okay.
Yes, we have Isabel. So could you please unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Dam. It was very interesting, and thank you very much. But I guess that it's not really a question, a core question, but rather a naive reaction.
No, I don't think it's going to be naive. Yeah.
No, the thing is that in your presentation, because I think that we understand what you want to say, but maybe something was missing from myself, at least. It's a better picture of how South Korean academia is functioning. So you're talking about Yi Yong-hun and how he's, he's a public intellectual doing YouTube videos, writing books, teachings, whatever. So maybe to make your argument even more striking, you should explain more to people like me who don't know that much about how it works and how it was built, how those professors, I mean, professionals, intellectuals are building a discourse on national history because of their maybe biography, training, and networks and everything. So instead of just saying things like in post-colonialism and like an ideological framework, just to see deeper into their personal milieu. So that's, I would have liked to know more about this, because I'm like you, I'm just not shocked, but I'm surprised. I have many questions. I would like to know more about this. So please write something about this.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment. I think basically you're right. I mean, I had to use very much oversimplified landscape. I mean, and to map, because
no, because
like,
you know it, but I don't know
like
it.
you said, there are very different various kind of group in the academia, even if it's small world. So like, yeah, I think I inevitably or accidentally omitted a few groups. Yeah, you can say that. Yeah. But here, in a limited time, I have to do some mapping in order to clearly explain what's really happening right now, because I need to show the whole landscape, right? But then Yi Yong-hun 선생님 kept, disrupting that map, more oversimplifying than me. So yeah, that's true. I'm thinking about project. It's just like you said, it's about the historians itself. I have done a few, that's why I have asserted like we need to do some more historiographical work. I have done this, but I haven't done it in English. I have been doing this historiography thing, but I mostly focused on discourse itself, like 사대, like 교린, the main core concept that actually constitute the whole narrative of Korean history, of post-1945 South Korean historiography. I've done why this kind of concept was redefined in a particular historical context. Recently, I have published why Max Weber's bureaucracy and his modernization theory really came to matter in South Korean history, South Korean academia, from like, I don't know. Well, it's after 1945 basically. So I've done that kind of things in Korean continuously. I'll try to publish them in English, and then I'll try to come up with more historical studies centered on historians itself. Maybe that way, I don't have to be angry, maybe. But if I'm so angry like Yi Yong-hun 선생님, I wouldn't do those. I wasn't calm enough. It's gonna be impossible for me to do this kind of historiographical work. So I'm trying to be calm, but like I have a few friends between me and Yi Yong-hun 선생님 back then, like in early 2010. And I heard this story. Those people, they're mostly a lot older than me. They told me like, oh, I met Yi Yong-hun 선생님 and he talked a lot about your work, and he came up with a lot of compliments. Then I felt like, oh, maybe I'm doomed. My argument is so different from him. So I knew this was coming. But then at least, like I told you before, if I try to demonize him, I wouldn't do this kind of talk. So yeah, you're correct. I should do that when it comes to I should do more historiography centered on historians. So please take this presentation as a part of that process. Thank you, Isabel. Really nice to meet you again.
Thank you for those answers. So we have another question from our Patrick, and then we have Il-soo and then Ji-hun. So first I will read out loud Patrick's question, and then after we hear from Daham, then I guess Il-soo and Ji-hun's question will be the last of today's session. Okay, so let me read the question. Regarding Isabel's question, I would like to add another short question. Why do South Koreans still use term new right historiography when speaking of Yi Yong-hun and others? I have studied the new right movement in my conclusion, the proponents themselves declared the new right to have failed by late 2008, with the scholars going their own ways, and among them, Yi Yong-hun probably becoming most radicalized. Yet he is still referred as a new right historian by most. The way I see it for contemporary history, there are largely three streams: conservative, reactionary activists and media, progressive activists and media, and dry academics who largely get heard in public, get unheard by public, I'd say. Thus, not every historical fact gets incorporated into cultural memory, quote unquote, giving itself birth to myth. Would you agree with this for pre-modern history as well?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I totally. The point is, would I agree with that comment when it comes to the pre-modern historiography, right? What happens in pre-modern times, right? I totally agree. I totally agree. Well, they say Joseon is only modern. They have periodized that era as only modern. 근세. Basically, it's not that different from what we're experiencing in modern times, I guess. So that's why I actually kept using this kind of terms like invention, imaginary stuff to understand what happens back then in 15th century. I mean, whether it was Joseon court, whether it was like 민중, like people from the bottom of social hierarchy, they could have imagined something. They could hope for something. I'm not thinking that all these theories and post-colonial arguments could not be applied to pre-modern times. And then I have one question for Patrick, right? Thank you for comment. And basically, I agree with you. I mean, Yi Yong-hun must be one of the most radicalized historian among those scholars who are defined as new right. But I don't. Well, they may not be cohesive as before. But even then, there are other scholars who I'm sorry, I forgot the name of those scholars. They do sociology, like Yu Seok-chun. We have other kind of scholar who actually kept coming up with similar kind of far-right revisionist arguments when it comes to Korean history. So yeah, probably I'll think about what's gonna be better concept to define far-right historiography of Yi Yong-hun and what he has been doing. And then you actually put like 3 categories, right? That sounds interesting. I'm not so sure. I'm not familiar with your work. I'm sorry. I'm not a person who actually. What is it? Sorry, my English is getting worse. I'm not the social. so I'm not that I'm not a networking person, so please understand I don't know you. So please let me know your if you have other things to talk about, just email me. Yeah, I'll be gladly write your email back, and we can talk about it later too. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it was very interesting comments. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Thank you. So Ilsu, can you unmute your mic and ask the question?
Sure. Thank you so much for your talk. 한국말로 할까요? 아니면 영어로 할까요? 영어 너무 잘하시는데.
Well, yeah, I prefer Korean language because I told you, like,
네,
I'm doing this
좀,
as a
예, 조금만 더
heterolingual
네,
address,
알겠습니다.
right?
네,
But
네.
you can, but it's okay. I mean, is it okay for us to talk in Korean? I mean, at least this is Korea related.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Bilingual.
This is bilingual kind of community.
Yeah. But even then, I don't know. I mean, do it in English then.
예, 우선 질문을 드리면 우선 그 선생님 발표하신 거에 대해서 그러니까 이영훈 선생님 관련해서 질문 하나 드리고 싶고, 이제 그 선생님의 지금까지 하신 작업에 대해서 좀 큰 질문도 좀 드리고 싶은데, 우선 이영훈 선생님 이 책 이제 문제가 굉장히 많고 여러 면에서 또 괜히 이영훈 선생님까지 끌어들이셔가지고 이런 일을 만들어 너무 고생 많이 하신 것 같은데, 이제 저는 그 문제가 굉장히 많다고 생각하지만 이제 그 기생 얘기를 할게요. 아까 기생이랑 위안부랑 연결시켜서 말하는 부분이 있잖아요. 근데 이제 기생이 조선 시대에도 그 함경도나 그런 군인들이 배치되어 있는 데다가 이제 여자들을 보내고 그러는 거를 했었잖아요. 그런 걸 했었고.
Basically they're female slaves. Who were allocated with administrative and military units in frontier regions.
예, 그런 거 했었고, 또 이제 심지어는 이제 주한미군에도 기총 같은 걸 만들어가지고 어떻게 보면 여자들을 이렇게 제공한 그런 굉장히 어글리한 그런 역사들이 있었는데, 근데 이제 제가 이영원 선생님 그 부분 읽으면서 느낀 거는 그냥 이분은 그냥 이런 굉장히 이렇게 슬픈 역사가 옛날에도 있었고 지금도 있고 막 그렇다는 얘기를 하시고 싶은 것 같은데, 그게 특별히 이렇게 좀 문제가 되는 건 아니지 않나. 그런 인상을 저는 받았었거든요. 그러니까 이분이 말씀하시는 거는 이제 이 군인들 국가가 이제 약자인 여자들을 이렇게 이런 상황에 몰아넣고 막 그런 거를 전체적인 비판이지, 이게 막 조선 시대만의 비판도 아니었고 한국만의 비판도 아니었고 이런 게 이제 전 세계적으로 많이 있었으니까 그런 내용으로 저는
I totally. Let me answer your question one by one. Is it okay?
예.
Well, I think this kind of practice, I can say this kind of practice has been there for a long time. As an institution or just practice, I think I can say, yeah, it was there. I'm not disagreeing with him for that point. You know what I mean? I agree. I can agree that the problem is what actually mattered for me. Why actually I have to respond to him with my criticism is that what he actually particularized as Korea's unique tradition. I mean, he kept emphasizing these kind of practice as a Korea's particular unique tradition. That's for sure. If you read the book, it actually keeps surfacing. Okay, I can say, well, there has been that kind of practice, but the thing is, like I told you before, he has to be responsible for the consequences, because I believe we're doing this, our study of history as a practice of politics. His argument kept empowering the denial of Japanese far-right colonialist arguments. You know what I mean? That is the reason. I mean, that's the problem. That's the part I feel so problematic. If he actually denied that, oh, I'm not working with them, I'm not doing that, well, then that will be fine. But logically, he's doing that, and he actually kept supporting their denial, basically saying that, you know, this, they used to say it all happens because of masculinity, toxic masculinity from foreign forces, right? But then he wanted to say, oh, it's from Korea's own tradition. Well, there is some part we can call it critical, but that critical part, if that part could be critical, then I think it should be used to widen our scope to the issue of comfort women, to be more reflective, to be more critical, not encouraging Japanese far-right revisionist argument to come up with further denial. Well, who's going to be responsible for that? I mean, think about what they're doing is actually torturing those people who suffer actually enough. Well, we don't have enough of them right now. They're gonna die. But I mean, let me tell you this. Well, I had a lot of personal experience. I had to go through because of his reference of my works. I never met him before. I've never well, we never met each other. But then my sonback phoned me and said, "Hey, Daham, you're gonna be famous." So I said, "What?" And he told me like, "Hey, Professor Yi Yong-hun, a respected historian. I respected him the most. He actually said your name, your work, and on YouTube lecture, and then people like went crazy, coming up with all these replies and coming up with all this spin-off. I didn't even know the meaning of the spin-off based on your argument." That's what I heard. So like, okay, I knew this coming, but believe me, I'm the one who wrote that article. My argument is totally different from it. And why you're telling me? You're giving me nightmare too. So I pretended like I'm too busy. So I had to hang up the phone. But then we came this close. We almost quarreled. I mean, it was from that time, it's been like, I don't know, like 6 or 7 years. I have suffered from insomnia just because of that. Am I just sensitive? I don't know. What I have done is done based on particular motivation, particular object that I want to reach. But then he ravaged it. Well, I'm not so sure he's deliberately doing it or not, but actually seeing what you have created, what you made a lot of effort for, is being used in that way. I was so sad. I'm sorry. It was after I wrote this article in Korean last year that I escaped from this insomnia. But think about those 위안부 할머니. They have been tortured for a long time throughout their life. So I don't think we can give him immunity, like, oh, maybe he's not doing this deliberately.
예, 네, 아무튼 말씀 잘 들었고요. 이제 한 가지만 더 여쭤보려고 그러는데, 선생님이 지금 하신 작업이, 지금까지 해오신 작업이 이제 약간 저는 이제 팬으로서 이제 질문을 드리는 건데, 이제 선생님이 하신 작업은 이제 간단하게 이제 설명하면 이제 민족주의 사관을 비판을 하고 계시고, 이제 그거를 대체하면서 약간 그 조선 초에서 중화적 세계관, 중화주의 같은 걸 수용을 하는 과정을 이렇게 보여주시는 작업인 것 같은데, 제가 이제 읽으면서 정말 많이 배우고 너무 좋은데 조금 궁금한 게 몇 가지가 있어가지고, 하나는 이제 명나라에 대해서 자발적인 사대를 하잖아요. 자발적인 사대를 하고, 근데 어떻게 근데 또 다른 한편으로는 소제국을 운영을 하고 있잖아요. 자기들이 또 제국 같은 게 조그맣게 있어요. 그거는 이제 16세기까지 끌고 가잖아요. 근데 그거는 어떻게 설명을 할 수 있는지 그게 이제 하나 궁금한 거고, 또 하나는 이건 조금 훈민정음이랑도 관련이 있는 것 같은데, 이제 제가 이게 머리가 나빠가지고 제대로 이해를 못했을 수도 있습니다. 근데 어쨌든 근데 이제
You don't have to put it that way.
근데 이제 그 어떻게, 그러니까 이런 관계에 있어서 이 중화주의 세계관을 이렇게 조선이랑 명나라랑 같이 이렇게 받치고 있는 이런 상황에서 조선은 중국이 굉장히 필요하고 그 중국에서 문물이 들어오는 거기도 하고 중국이 종주국이라고 하는데, 중국의 입장에서는 조선이 꼭 있어야 되는 건 아니잖아요. 그러니까 어떻게 보면은 수많은 조공국 중에 하나일 뿐이고, 그런 면에 있어서 훈민정음이 약간 좀 트랜스내셔널하게 볼 수 있는지, 저는 약간 제가 느끼기에는 한문을 정확하게 발음하고 이해하고 또 가르치기 위해서 훈민정음이라는 게 약간 탄생되지 않았나, 그런 느낌을 받았거든요. 이게 무슨 뭐 훈민정음이 당연히 이제 막 한국 민족을 위해서 만든 건 당연히 아니지만, 한국의 민족성을 고취하기 위해서 만든 건 당연히 아니지만, 어떻게 보면 중국 문명을 제대로 알아듣고 수입하기 위해서 만든 거는 맞지 않나, 약간 그런 생각이 들었는데, 이게 좀 다르게 이해하는 방법이 있는가?
Yeah, thank you for coming up with that question. The question is really huge. Well, actually, I have explained it in my talk quite a lot. I mean, the point is, those two phases of 훈민정음 has been understood totally as a totally separate feature, contradicting each other always. That was what actually existing nationalist historiography has conceptualized when it comes to the promulgation of 훈민정음. So from there, so it depends on how you actually approach it.
Sorry to jump in, Daham, but we are kind of approaching to the end of this time. So
okay,
well, you can kind of summarize your answers in a short way, and then maybe we can stop the recording after this. Mm-hmm.
Oh, there's one more questionnaire, right?
Yes, probably we'll need to go through that after the recording is over. Would that be okay?
Okay, all right. Yeah.
So, so sorry again for interrupting, but if
그 시간이 좀 모자라면은 그 정다함 선생님한테 따로 드릴게요.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, 조수 선생님, you can, you can email me.
Yes.
Yeah, we can like Facebook Messenger together.
Yeah.
So,
thank you.
I guess I think this is the kind of the wrapping up time for today's session. So again, sorry for the delay. That was kind of unavoidable because of the technical issues. But I really appreciate for everyone for keeping in this room to keep this discussion lively and make it global from every audiences from Europe, North America, and from Korea. So thanks again for this participation. And I hope everyone can continue to share your interest in the Joseon History Society. So your information that is needed to keep updated can be found on our chatting box, the Joseon History Society website, YouTube channel, and if you want to subscribe to our mailing list, it's everything is available there. So please join our team and also take a moment to contribute your own research, up-to-date research to our Joseon History Society as well. So we're still seeking for the candidates for invited speaker. So please contact us so that we can host you for this upcoming events. So thanks again for joining today's Joseon History Society Zoom meeting. And on behalf of the Joseon History Society, I hope you have a wonderful day, night after this recording is over. Thank you so much.
감사합니다.